Adam, you work within very diverse fields and you've managed to bring them all together. Neuroscience, evolutionary biology, psychology. There's so much we can discuss. But something I've written down, which is a quote of yours, you said that what sets us apart is a life in the mind, the ability to imagine. Perhaps we could begin by you explaining what do you mean by that and what does it mean to live a life in the mind?
So like many people, I've always been fascinated or long been fascinated by the question of what sets us apart from other creatures on Earth, if anything does. I mean, I think this interest goes back to my undergraduate days. And it struck me over the years that a very strong candidate is our capacity to detach ourselves from the here and now, recollect the past, anticipate the future, enter and create the virtual worlds of science and art. So broadly, the achievements of the imagination. And that's what I had in mind. That quotation is in fact from Robin Dunbar. It's Robin Dunbar, as I'm sure you know, is an anthropologist who's very much interested in the same question. And I think his thoughts and mine have converged on the same conclusion that the imagination is a strong candidate for the source of human uniqueness, such as it is.
Mm. Do you see imagination not merely as a creative faculty, but as the very medium through which all human experiences take place?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I guess it prompts me to say that one of the difficulties in thinking and writing about imagination is that it's clearly not a term of science. It's a kind of slippery term, which we use in a number of different ways. So it may be worth teasing three of those apart at the outset. Perhaps I'll work backwards, because I think the sense of imagination that we most often use colloquially is what's been called productive imagination, I think by William James. So that's the ability that underlies our creativity, our capacity to make things that are both new and useful. And that's we'll come back to this, it's a rather special sense. The second sense, which I think is in a way core, is what's been called reproductive imagination. So that's our ability to represent things in their absence, typically using their sensory properties. So if I ask you to imagine an apple, or imagine your front door, or your partner, you'll probably be able to call to mind the sensory features of apple, front door, partner, the look, the appearance. And when you do so, you're engaging in reproductive imagination of a sensory kind. And I think that's a very colloquial sense of imagination. There's a third sense which is less colloquial, but which you pointed to in your question. Psychologists will occasionally speak of the retinal image or the perceptual image. So that's our immediate experience of the here and now. And the fact that we can use imagination in that sense, even if it's not terribly colloquial to do so, reminds us that our moment-to-moment experience is a creative act. I think it's fairly clear that there's a kind of creativity involved in reproductive and productive imagination. It's less obvious that there's a creative act involved in our moment-to-moment experience, but there are very good reasons for believing that there is, and those reasons range from the psychological. So illusions provide an example. In the book, I have an image of my partner, in fact, running over a bridge, and the same image is reproduced at several different distances, and she looks much bigger in the distance than she does near to, because your mind makes an automatic correction for distance. So that's a slightly sophisticated example of the workings of the mind in perception. More obviously, when you look at the moon and you see the man in the moon, you're engaging in pareidolia. You're imposing a pattern that doesn't exist there. I have a personal teenage example of waking in the night to see a burglar standing at the foot of my bed wearing a striped football shirt. I was terrified. I shouted at him, and over the next 2 or 3 seconds, the image dissolved into a pattern of light shining through a slatted fence. So those are kind of psychological examples, or so I'm providing some psychological evidence for believing that perception is creative, but there's also the more straightforward neurological evidence. Our experience depends entirely on the activity that's occurring in our heads, consuming oxygen and glucose every moment of our lives. So there are these three senses of imagination. One, which I think is not very colloquial, but is philosophically very interesting, the sense that reminds us that there's something imaginative about perception itself. Then there is the reproductive imagination, our capacity to, for example, visualize an apple in our mind's eye. And then there's the productive imagination, our ability to create things which are both new and useful. and coming back to something I hinted at earlier, it's curious that we use the same term for both the productive and the reproductive imagination. And I guess it has to do with the fact that many creative people use imagery in their creative thinking. Mm. But we don't have to. And one good reason for thinking we don't have to is that people with aphantasia, which I'm sure we'll come on to discuss, people who lack sensory imagination can be highly productive and imaginative in that more general sense. So sensory imagery is not required for creativity, but it's often involved in the process.
I'm glad you touched on that, because often when I interact with patients, I notice that when it comes to imagination, many people still associate imagination with fantasy or childish make-believe.
Yeah.
Why do you think this is so? Why do you think imagination remains so misunderstood, even though it's so pervasive in ordinary experiences?
Yeah, well, I suppose the imagination is a kind of gift and a curse, and it can mislead us. It can take us into realms of unproductive fantasy. There's the recently described syndrome of maladaptive daydreaming. People spend far too much of their lives lying on their couch or in bed, dreaming about what might be. So that's a rather unproductive use of the imagination, and that's one of the connotations of imagination. But I think people generally regard the imagination as a good thing. In fact, one of the reviewers of my book said just that, and we describe Dickens or Tolstoy as highly imaginative writers, and when we use the word in that way, we're commending them. So imagination has its pluses and minuses for sure. I think it is in many ways the source of our human uniqueness, but it can also be a problem for us.
Mm. Your book's titled The Shape of Things Unseen. Wonderful read, a beautiful book, so descriptive. And one of the things I was thinking about when you wrote this, as I read about aphantasia, which you briefly just touched on, and we'll definitely discuss soon, as we just spoke about this earlier, but when I was writing my dissertation, I had quoted some of your work and had no idea who you were at the time. This was many years ago. And it's so great to finally put a face to the name. And in a case like that, I think it's perfect that we're talking about this putting a face to the name, or trying to imagine the person you're thinking about or writing about. When you discovered this, because when I started med school, this was about 2011, this concept, aphantasia, this term did not exist. However, we learn about it. It's very indirect. We speak about it, certain things that are similar, like prosopagnosia. We've got all these terms and all these similar phenomenon. And then once I'm done with med school, 2016 onward, suddenly this new concept exists. What is it like to almost rediscover, but discover something so unique? And what's the journey been like since then?
So it was very serendipitous, this discovery or rediscovery, as you imply. I must say it's been enormous fun. It just happens that this stumbling upon this phenomenon seems to have unlocked a huge number of really fascinating avenues for exploration. Maybe I'll tell the story in a little more detail later, but I think that the trick, in a way, related simply to the creation of a word. So clearly people must have existed who lacked a mind's eye, lacked sensory imagination, since time immemorial, but they didn't have a flag to fly under, so to speak. And because I encountered a number of people who were describing this phenomenon, it became clear that it would be helpful to give it a name. And I consulted an old classicist friend who suggested that we borrow Aristotle's term of the mind's eye, phantasia, and tagged on an A, hence aphantasia. And the term caught on. The press liked it, so it got an airing. And I initially wrote a paper describing a group of 21 people with aphantasia. The number of contacts turned into 20,000 over the course of the next few years. And yeah, it's been a delight. It's been very exciting and unexpected.
Let's try and dissect that a bit. So, what is the mind's eye for anyone who's not familiar with that phrase? Where does it come from? What does it mean, firstly? And then let's move on to what a blind mind's eye would be, or an aphantasic mind.
So I think the mind's eye is actually a Shakespearean phrase, and it refers to our ability to visualize. So most people, if you ask them to call to mind an apple, their front door, the the face of their partner will be able to do so, and will have an experience that is at least weakly visual. It plays quite a big part in autobiographical memory for most people. So if I ask you to remember a day from your last holiday, the most memorable day from your last holiday, most people will, again, have an experience that's somewhat visual. They'll be able to remember the look of the place they were in, the look of the people they were with. There may be more to it than visual recollections, so they might be able to remember sounds or touches or the feel of the experience. So that's what's meant by the mind's eye, by sensory imagery. And as I say, most of us possess sensory imagery, but we seem to vary very widely in the vividness of that imagery. We've used a scale called the Vividness of Visual Imagery questionnaire to try to get a handle on this. So that invites you to visualize 16 scenarios. For example, you're watching the sun rising above the horizon into a hazy sky. Again, most people, when they do that, will have an experience that's somewhat visual. You can then rate the vividness of your image from a 5, which means as vivid as real seeing. And about 10% of people say their imagery is like that, to a 1, no image at all, just thinking about it. And that's the situation for people who lack a mind's eye. So there turns out to be a group of people, probably about 4% of the population, depending where you draw the line, who, when you give them that sort of exercise, say, well, I know about apples, I can recognize apples, I know about suns rising over the horizon, I can think about them perfectly well, but I don't see anything. And typically, people who lack a mind's eye will for a long time assume that when others are speaking about visualizing about the mind's eye, they're just using words in a purely figurative, metaphorical way. But then at a certain point, they realize that actually people are having an experience which is somewhat visual and which they never achieve. Our work was a kind of rediscovery rather than a brand new discovery, because among others, Francis Galton, 19th century psychologist, who was the first person to devise a questionnaire to quantitate imagery, had noticed that there were some people whose power of visualization was 0, as he put it, but no one really had focused on the interesting folk at these extremes of the vividness distribution. It turns out that we focused initially on visual imagery, but it turns out that most people who are aphantasic actually lack sensory imagery more widely. So it isn't usually an isolated visual phenomenon. Generally, they don't have much of a mind's ear or a mind's fingertip either, and the idea of imagining smells and tastes is very alien to them. And there is a kind of interesting pattern of associations. So often people with aphantasia have difficulty recognizing faces, not always, but quite often. They very typically say that their autobiographical memory is rather thin, rather factual. They don't have that capacity for mental time travel, for re-experiencing the past, reliving the past that many of us have. There's an association with autism in some folk. Really interestingly, most people with aphantasia dream visually. So there's a fascinating dissociation between wakeful imagery and dreaming imagery. So most people with aphantasia know what it's like to visualize, because they do so very vividly in their dreams. They just can't make it happen during wakefulness. So that's a kind of thumbnail sketch of aphantasia.
I think it's important, Adam, at this point, for anyone who's watching or listening, trying to figure out exactly how is it possible for someone to even prove this or show this. You have various different techniques and ways to do this. One of them being for someone to imagine a face of someone, or a light, let's say, allow the pupils to constrict or dilate. Do you want to maybe run through, you don't have to go through in detail, but at least a few ways that people can understand exactly how this is tested and proved?
Sure. So one reaction to the findings I've just been describing might be doubt, skepticism, on the grounds that it's very difficult to know what someone else is experiencing, and how can you be sure that the differences that I've been highlighting aren't simply different ways of describing the same kind of underlying experience. And I think there are a number of reasons now for thinking that the differences that people are pointing to, the introspective differences are pointing to, are genuine, are real. And it's helpful, I think, to think of a kind of triangulation between first-person reports, measurements of behavior, and physiological measurements. So what do I mean by measurements of behavior? Well, it is possible to measure the richness of people's autobiographical memory. There are quite well-developed techniques for doing that, like the autobiographical interview developed by Brian Levine in Toronto. And now a number of groups have shown that when you ask people with aphantasia or hyperphantasia, very vivid imagery, to describe their salient memories from their personal past, people with aphantasia give much less rich descriptions than people with hyperphantasia. So that's a psychological measure. Then turning to the physiological measurements, a very nice experiment. It's not my technique, but a nice technique that's been applied to aphantasia and aphantasia involves the pupils. So if you look into the sun, your pupils will constrict. If you look into a dark room, your pupils will dilate. It turns out that if you have aphantasia, you don't see those. I'm sorry, I've missed a step. If you look into the sun, your pupils will constrict. Look into a dark room, your pupils will dilate. If you have imagery and you imagine looking into the sun or into a dark room, your pupils behave in the same way, constrict, dilate. If you have aphantasia, you don't see those pupillary responses. Another nice example involves measurement of the galvanic skin response, essentially sweating, when you read people really scary stories. And this is work from Joel Pearson's group in Sydney, and they showed that normally, if you read such a story to somebody with imagery, there will be a change in their GSR. They'll sweat a little, and these are quite scary stories. So you imagine you're lying in the sea on a balmy day. There's a nice chatter of conversation from the beach. You're just letting yourself float in the water, and then conversation quietens. You look up and you see that all the heads are turned towards you, and you look over your shoulder and you see a fin advancing, and things go from bad to worse in this story. Certainly it made me sweat a bit. Turns out that people with aphantasia don't have that galvanic skin response. And they performed a nice control experiment of showing people with aphantasia scary pictures to which they do show the skin response. So it seems to be that lacking imagery prevents the gut response, if you like, because imagery mediates between the verbal description and the autonomic visceral response. Helps to explain why people with aphantasia often don't enjoy novels very much. They don't enjoy descriptive writing very much. And then most directly of all, there's now been work looking into the brain. And it does seem that there are differences in the brain between people with imagery and without imagery. I'll give a couple of examples. So I think we did the first study of this kind a few years back now. And in that study, we looked at resting state fMRI. So you just ask your participants to lie in the scanner and chill. This is a wonderful technique. You can use it to pick out all the networks of the active brain, because they continue to tick over when you rest. And it seems that people with vivid imagery have stronger resting connections between areas at the front of the brain that are basically involved in thought and areas at the back of the brain involved in vision, and people with aphantasia. So helping to explain why thought would translate itself more readily into imagery in people with vivid imagery than people lacking it. And then more recently, there have now been a number of studies, brain imaging studies over the last year, but one of them from Yanghao Liu in Paris has shown that although you do see many of the same kinds of visual activation in people with aphantasia when they try to imagine, that activation is less well coordinated, less well integrated, less widely broadcast in the brain than in people with imagery. So there is, if you like, a neural signature for aphantasia. So you can triangulate between first-person reports, behavioural measures, and physiological measures in quite a satisfying way, which I think helps to meet the skeptics' reasonable doubts about aphantasia.
I think it's particularly fascinating because I was speaking to a friend about this, telling them I'm about to chat to you the fascinating work that's been done, and I tried to explain exactly what aphantasia is. And the moment I mentioned it to her, she said, "Oh, shame, man, that must be such a difficult life." And I said, No, not really, because a lot of these people are creative. They don't even know they have this problem. They're living life completely normal. So it's not necessarily an abnormality. It's just atypical. Do you have anything to comment on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that's in a way one of the most interesting and surprising things about aphantasia. So often when people first hear about it, as you say, they kind of react, well, how can they remember? How can they think? And aphantasia, although it makes a I think a big difference to people's inner lives makes a surprisingly small difference to their performance. And that is puzzling and intriguing. I think it proves that Aristotle was wrong when he wrote in De Anima that the soul never thinks without a phantasm. Clearly, you can get by without much in the way of sensory imagery. It reminds us that there are a number of ways of representing things in their absence other than sensory imagination. And, you know, language does pretty well. All the forms of other forms of notation that we use, for example, mathematical notation. And clearly, it's possible to be creative, productive, imaginative in that broader productive sense in the absence of imagery. So we have numerous examples now, including Ed Catmull, the past president of Pixar Disney, who won the Turing Prize for his discoveries in computer animation, or Craig Venter, who was the first person, I think, to decode the genome, who's attributed some of his scientific prowess to the fact that his mind is not cluttered by imagery. So I don't think of aphantasia as a disorder. I think of it as an intriguing variation in human experience, and I think it has got pluses and minuses, like imagination itself. So people with aphantasia often do regret that they can't visualize the face of a departed family member, for example, or see their girlfriend in her absence, or visualize last year's holiday. But it may be that they're somewhat more present, a bit less troubled by longings and regrets. Aphantasia seems to nudge people in a scientific direction, a little bit more likely to be working in STEM. So there may be some advantages, cognitive advantages to aphantasia. And the other thing to say is that although I think it's very fascinating, it is of course just one small piece in the huge jigsaw of human cognition. So of course there are all sorts of other influences in play in any individual psyche. And curiously, aphantasia doesn't even preclude things that you might assume it would rule out, like being a creative visual artist. So one big surprise to us early on was that we were contacted by a growing number of aphantasic artists. I've certainly got over 100 contacts now in one of my files. We put together an exhibition of art by aphantasic and hyperphantasia artists, and many of the aphantasic artists said, it's actually a stimulus to me to create because I can't see things in my mind's eye, and I love the visual world. I want to recreate it.
And that's such an unfathomable thought for people who don't have this lack of experience, because to us there's only one way we can perceive reality, and that's the way we've been given, or the way we can perceive it. Because I was watching that clip that you played in your Royal Institute lecture of The Little Mermaid, and the way he was painting, the artist is painting that, and it's incredible. You can see that there's something different happening versus the way we would paint, and it's fascinating to watch that.
So this is Glenn Keane, who's a Disney artist, apparently a well-known animator, who says he's had many arguments with his colleagues. They say, but you must be able to visualize. And he says, no, I know what I want to draw, and I draw it. I can't see it beforehand.
Your work, it's been pioneering work. So this first part of the conversation, I tried to lay out the landscape of imagination. Your pioneering work in aphantasia, hyperphantasia, this absence or overabundance, they illuminate sort of a hidden diversity of inner experience. And just a few days ago, I was speaking to Russell Hilbert about exploring inner experience, and the fact that he has what's descriptive experience sampling, and he shows how the inner monologue doesn't exist the same way we perceive it. And I've been finding these last few weeks exploring this with different people. It shows how diverse this experience is. What do you think that these diverse experiences really reveal about consciousness itself?
Yeah, well, yes, I'm glad you mentioned Russ, because his work with descriptive experience sampling has been pioneering. Well, I said at the beginning that imagination was one of the hallmarks of human cognition. I guess a second hallmark is difference, and that, I think, reflects our neural makeup. 86,000 million cells in the brain, on average, several thousand, 10,000 connections between for each neuron. So just a vast storage space for difference. And we know now that learning and memory are, at least to a fair degree, coded in differences in the strength of connections between neurons at those synapses. So I think it shouldn't surprise us that we have very different inner worlds. I was struck while I was researching for the book and speaking to people who are highly productive in different fields, that they have trained their brains in such a way that they can kind of switch their creativity on and off. They've programmed their brains to be creative in their particular domains. But the programs that they're running must be very different, to produce an entertaining novel versus a theory about the first few moments of creation. And I suspect that one of the reasons that that the past strikes us as a foreign country is the related one, that the brains of people 100,000 years ago were very different to ours. So I'm not sure I've quite answered your question, but I think the presence of these invisible inner differences makes sense given what we know about the nature of our brain and its vast capacity for encoding difference. What's to tell us about the science of consciousness? Well, I mean, I guess it's an article of faith for most people who are interested in the problem of consciousness, not all, but most, that differences in experience correspond to differences in the structure or function of the brain. And I think we're exploring those differences through this kind of work.
The first part, I tried to lay out the landscape of imagination. What I'd like to do now is just go into perception as imagination. Because in your recent book, you argue that even our experience of the here and now is itself imaginative. So could you unpack that idea? In what sense are we imagining the present moment?
Yeah. So we touched on this at the start. So I'll maybe run over some of that ground again and in a little more detail. So when we open our eyes and look at the world, it seems that it's just there for us. There's no effort involved in looking at the garden outside the window. I don't have to do any work to bring it into being. But that sense of ease is, I think, very deceptive. I think the world, as we perceive it, depends on creativity within our brains, on a kind of generative act, relies on a vast store of accumulated skill and knowledge, which is invisible to us most of the time. But there are a number of ways that we can make it somewhat visible. So illusions provide one example. There are numerous, wide range of illusions which show us that what we see, what we perceive, doesn't always correspond to what's there. And often illusions are explained by the fact that we are making unconscious inferences. So I gave you the example of a size-distance illusion. If you see the same image superimposed on a photo close and far, it will look larger in the distance because your mind makes an unconscious compensation for the distance. Francis Bacon in the 16th century said that sense passes over to imagination before reason has judged, and I think he was producing a very modern thought. Essentially, the idea that Helmholtz developed in the 19th century, that perception involves a great deal of unconscious inference. So illusion provides one example. I mentioned pareidolia. We often see forms where there are none. So, I don't like spiders very much. I often look down at the ground and see a spider, which turns out to be a twist of cotton. My slightly anxious spider-phobic mind is projecting spider wherever there's a shape that might just be one. If you like, I'm predicting spiders where there are none. So the line of thought which I'm pursuing here meshes with the idea of the predictive brain, which I'm sure you've discussed with others. I see that Carl Friston has been one of your interviewees. And then I guess at the extreme, hallucination provides a very compelling example of the creativity or generativity of the sensory brain. So in states of hallucination, people perceive things that aren't there at all, as if they were out in the world. And I give numerous examples in the book. I mean, one commonplace, slightly sad, but commonplace example is of bereavement hallucinations. So people who've lost a partner, more often than not, will experience the presence of the partner sometime over the following months, feel a touch, see the look, hear the voice of that person. Clearly, you have your brain's going to make a tremendously strong prediction that somebody who's been with you for many decades will still be there. And occasionally that prediction produces activity in the brain that kind of rises above a certain threshold, and you perceive the presence of someone who's no longer there. So there are many. There's a good deal of psychological evidence for the generativity, the creativity of perception. I think the neurological evidence is in a way more straightforward. So it's kind of eerie, isn't it? We don't most of the time reflect on the fact that to be doing anything at all, our heart has to be beating and our lungs have to be working for us. But to enjoy any moment of experience, our brains have to be active. We know that. We know that our brains are dynamic, energy-consuming, active, in a sense, autonomous organs. Your brain at the moment will be consuming roughly the amount of energy that you need to run a 20-watt bulb, burning oxygen, burning glucose. If you deprive it of the oxygen and the glucose, experience ceases. So for all those reasons, I think it's clear that experience is a kind of generative act. It's been described by Chris Frith, among others, as a controlled hallucination. So in a sense, we hallucinating the world around us all the time. But most of the time, fortunately, the hallucination that we experience corresponds with the reality that lies beyond. How do we know? Well, because we're here, we're grappling with that reality successfully. We've evolved and we survive, but we have no access to that, no direct access to that world around us, except through our experience, of course. And that experience, I think there's overwhelming evidence that experience is not a kind of direct readout of the world around us. It is something like a controlled hallucination.
Yeah, I think to me, that's one of the most fascinating things about experience, is that the more you learn about it, the more you realize that our naive realism towards realities, it's so apparent. And I remember when I wrote about this, it's almost like, it's like breaking free. It's kind of like realizing that this is not what we think it is. You mentioned people like Friston, Seth, all these people who are working on this controlled hallucination, or these Bayesian brains, these frameworks that sort of show that we're more like prediction machines rather than experiential systems seeing things as they are. But something I wrote down while reading your work was, if perception is imagination constrained by sensory input, could imagination then be seen as perception freed from those constraints?
Yes, I think in a sense it can, but I think there's a missing step there. It'll be interesting, I guess, for those listening to this to know that when we imagine an apple, imagine a face, imagine a sound, there's now very good evidence that we activate the brain regions that we would activate were we actually looking at that face, at the apple, hearing the sound. So when we engage in sensory imagery, we are running offline the systems that we use to perceive the world online. But yes, as you say, imagination frees us from some of the constraints imposed by reality, and it allows us to produce virtual, imaginary worlds as a result, using the material which perception has previously supplied by and large.
Yeah, I think it's quite a cool thing to think about, because then philosophically it raises the deepest question of all. If perception is itself imaginative, then does that blur the distinction between what is real and what is imagined? And yeah, I guess that's one of the puzzling features of reality, is that we might never know what the fundamental veridical nature of reality is.
I think it very much blurs that distinction. Absolutely. I mean, that doesn't negate the distinction between
Yes.
Reality and unreality, because there's a difference between a controlled and an uncontrolled hallucination. But no, absolutely. I think that's a very profound philosophical point. Too profound for.
Yeah, I think reality, in this sense, we should be clear, means consensus reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, and it's. I think there's both consensus among individuals and also the evidence from our evolution and our survival that our perception of the world is good enough. Our experience is doing its job.
Yeah, I think when I read your work, Adam, someone who you remind me of is Oliver Sacks, where very similar. So, neurologists exploring the deeper philosophical picture with a deep appreciation for the patient's experience, the lived experience, as well as the science. Do you see that that's fundamentally your goal in life, is to explore this with that feature in mind?
I absolutely do. I'm very flattered by the analogy of Oliver Sacks, because he was very much a hero and someone I read as I was training in neurology. So a great inspiration, and I think a wonderful writer. I would love to write as well as he did. But yeah, I absolutely see that as my mission, in a way, to try and bring together the subjective and the objective aspects of neurology and neuroscience. In fact, I think that's what doctors are doing all the time. We're constantly hearing stories from patients, and we're trying to map those onto our scientific understanding of the body, and then to translate back. So, for the patient to kind of explain their experiences to them in terms of physiology and pathophysiology. So, in a way, journalists, I think, doctors, I think, have to be rather like journalists. We're kind of translators moving between those two realms. Some doctors are real scientists. Not very many. Some are, but all of us have to move between those two domains.
Yeah, I agree. I think that as medical doctors, when you encounter a patient, you get to see it via two lenses: the objective third-person scientific experience, as well as the first-person subjective phenomenal experience, which is great because you get to then try your best to correlate as best as we can. And I often found that that's exactly what Sacks did back in the day. He was a neurologist who behaved like a psychiatrist as well as a philosopher, which is a beautiful way to. I think he wrote a book, The Mind's Eye, if I'm not mistaken. Yes.
Yeah, and in fact, he was aphantasic. He got in touch with me not long before he died.
Oh wow!
Aphantasic, but had a reasonably vivid mind's ear, and he was prosopagnosic. I think, by the way, it makes you a better doctor, doesn't it, to bear in mind those two elements of your work, because you don't want to get too lost in either domain, because it really is your job to remain attuned to people and their experiences and to the science.
I'm a huge Sacks fan. In fact, those colourful books, these colourful ones down here, all Sacks's books in a row. Just
I turned the camera a little. You find the same on my shelf. He was a wonderful writer. Yeah,
no, beautiful writer. He's actually the person who got me into being a doctor in the first place. I remember reading his book as a child. I think it was the Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and I remember thinking, this is something I would do. If it wasn't for astrophysics, that was the next best thing, and it was his writing that actually got me into it.
And interestingly, over time, I think he became more and more attuned to science, didn't he? I think he was a bit of a rebel initially, and he was kind of going against the grain.
Cycle and just chill. Yeah. He was quite rebellious.
Yeah, but he sort of moved more into the mainstream as time went by.
Well, on that note, moving towards science, let's now move into the science of imagination. So at this point, let's discuss the neural systems and shared meaning. Your book explores imagination in scientific terms, and one of them was running the mind offline. How literal is that? Is imagination just the brain rehearsing action perception loops in a simulated mode?
I think to some extent that's a fair description. So clearly, if I ask you now to imagine an apple in your mind's eye, you're going to have to do a wide range of things. You're going to have to understand what I'm saying, engaging language systems. You're going to have to remember what an apple looks like. So you're going to have to draw on memory. But it seems that to have an experience with a visual feel, you then need to use the information stored in memory to drive your visual system or to drive your sensory system sort of top down. So sensory imagination has been described as an echo of perception or as weak perception, and I think that's fair enough. There's no very good evidence from brain imaging that when we visualize, we do indeed activate brain regions, and we activate them in a stimulus-specific way. So if you imagine a face, you're going to activate your fusiform face area, which you know is very important for recognizing faces. If you imagine the sound of thunder, you're going to be activating auditory regions. So yes, I think that sensory imagery does indeed depend on combination of activity in frontoparietal regions, which kind of control your cognition. So you're going to have to imagine that apple, you're going to have to make a decision that that's what you want to do. You're going to have to organize your brain to do that. But then to have the sensory experience associated with the image of the apple, you'll need to activate those sensory regions top down.
The default mode network is often associated with imagination, mind wandering, autobiographical thought. What role do you see this network playing in shaping our world?
Yeah. So I'm sure that those listening to the program will know that there are a number of networks involved in cognition, some of which studies of the resting brain have revealed. The default mode network is a particularly fascinating network. In case anyone doesn't know about it, this is a network of regions which is particularly active in the resting brain. So its level of activity is higher in the resting brain than when you engage people when you impose on people an external task. It involves a variety of regions on the medial aspect of the frontal and parietal lobes, but also areas in the temporal lobes which have long been associated with memory. And it could be caricatured as a kind of daydreaming network because it is particularly active when people are recollecting the past, anticipating the future, thinking about moral quandaries. There is some really interesting evidence that when people are engaged in creative work, when they're actually producing, writing a song, painting a picture, or writing a novel, that a default mode network will be active, but unusually it will be active in conjunction with the executive frontoparietal regions, which normally are engaged when you are dealing with an external task. So you have typically in cognition, there's a kind of seesaw relationship and also an anti-correlation between the executive network and the default mode network. If you're resting and daydreaming, default mode network is active. If you've been given a task, tell me as many words as you can think of in the next minute beginning with the letter P, those frontoparietal networks become active. In the creative state, there seems to be a more harmonious relationship between those frontoparietal networks and the default mode network, which I think is intuitively very appealing. So I think the idea that creativity has to do with dreaming lucidly is an appealing idea. They're also in a relationship with the salience network. This is a network of regions which has to do with attributing value to activities and things in the world. And then I think creativity has to do with dreaming lucidly about things that matter to us. So there's the idea that creativity may involve a particularly harmonious interaction between default mode, frontoparietal and salience networks. This is a little bit fanciful, but there is some empirical evidence now that that's the case.
You briefly touching on this, but I think it's best for me to ask it directly. From an evolutionary standpoint, why do you think imagination evolved at all? I mean, what advantage does detaching from the present give us as a species?
Yeah. Well, I mean, another characteristic feature of human life that distinguishes us from animals is culture. Our lives are absolutely soaked through imbued with culture. We're we are constantly using skills, traditions, artifacts which have been developed over centuries, millennia. The words we use, the clothes we wear, the tools we're constantly working with. And culture ultimately depends on individual acts of human creativity. So there is a sense in which our human lives, that the bedrock of our human lives is imagination, in that productive sense, the sense of imagination that allows us to produce things that are both new and useful. And early on, I gave a definition of imagination which has to do with the capacity to detach ourselves from the here and now, and that detachment is really required for these acts of creativity. We'd have to remove ourselves from the immediate. We have to forget the kind of immediate biological demands and lose ourselves in creative tasks, creative work to bring about the cultural traditions and artifacts which define us.
Yeah, I think one of the things I wrote here was that you say that imagination is not simply about we imagining, but rather that we share imagination. And that's a beautiful image.
Yeah. There are four big ideas in the book, if you like, which I think we touched on all but the last one now. So I'll just very briefly rehearse them. The first is that we live much of our lives in our heads. We're very often detached from the here and now. There's overwhelming evidence for that, and most people listening to this program would probably agree that it's true from their own experience. And that becomes a little less puzzling when you appreciate that your moment-to-moment experience involves a generative act, a creative act. And as we've been discussing, when we engage in sensory imagery, we run those perceptual systems that are involved in moment-to-moment experience offline. Now, the second and third things I've said that I think would be true of animals. So I'm sure there are many animals who enjoy conscious experience. It depends on activity in their brains. And I think it's quite likely that many animals can imagine, in the sense, for example, that they dream. So animals have REM sleep, and I think there's no reason to suppose that they don't enjoy some conscious experience in their dreams. The fourth big idea in the book is that what is distinctive about us is that we have evolved to share what we imagine. And I think you can see the last 3 million years or so of human evolution since Australopithecines first began using tools in those terms. We have become extraordinarily accomplished mind sharers with the help of language, of course, but I think there are precursors to language, or capacities which are in a way more fundamental to language, like that ability for joint attention, which develops extraordinarily early in the lives of human infants, and our theory of mind, our intuitive understanding of what is passing through one another's minds, which I think is built on that joint attention that develops so early in the shared lives of infants and their parents.
Given the rise of AI currently and large language models, which generate creative outputs, but do you think machines can truly ever imagine, or is imagination just inseparable from conscious or embodied experience?
Well, this is such a difficult question, and AI is so impressive, isn't it? That I'm not sure any of us have quite yet had time to work out the answer to that question.
Sorry, Adam, but there's on Grok, if you go onto Grok, and there's a section, if you just click imagine, it just starts to produce so much high quality, very, very imaginative and creative images. But is it really, really an imagination?
So I don't think that large language models are conscious, have experience. That would be my intuition. I suspect that most people would agree with that at the moment. So if you regarded consciousness as a prerequisite for what you're describing as real imagination, then no, current AI systems don't have imagination in that sense. They clearly have some of the elements of imagination, though. I mean, one of the processes involved in imagination is the ability to produce a huge number of variations on a theme. A little as the genome does through mutation, and it's probably I would think AI is capable not only of generating variations but also selecting between them, which is a kind of another crucial step. So it's on the way to producing outputs that are, I think it has arrived at a state in which you can produce outputs that are that somewhat rival those that we produce through imaginative work. But I don't think it has conscious experience of the process, and I don't think that at the moment it's quite capable of achieving outputs like those that we value most highly. But it may well get there before long.
I mean, one of the things that these large language models do is often hallucinate, confabulate, generate completely incorrect information. And I think that would be the best way to move on from. As a neurologist, as someone in the medical field, you're often encountering disorders, extremes, and uses of imagination that would otherwise be called pathological. At what point would you consider an aphantasic or a hyperphantasic a striking example that's not let's say atypical, but rather disordered? I know if we had to look at it from a medical perspective, it would be if this is affecting their life, their quality of life, or impacting relationships, etc., causing harm.
Yep.
But from a, let's say, perceptual standpoint, if you had to look at it in terms of someone studying it behind a lab, when do you see it as something completely running amok, let's say?
Yeah. I mean, as you imply, clinically, the concern, or the question is whether the experiences are impacting somebody's life in a way that causes them serious practical disadvantage. And I think that criterion is actually quite important because many people have experiences that might be thought of as pathological, but really aren't, because they're not bothering the individual concerned, and they actually have a potential value. So, I mean, an obvious example is voice hearing. Voice hearing is associated, of course, with psychosis in some cases, and it doesn't have a very good reputation generally. But there's a fair proportion of people, at least 1% of the population, who regularly hear voices which don't disturb them. They live quite happily with them, often a single voice, often a benign one. And many writers, many authors describe harnessing voice hearing in their creative work. I think it was Ray Bradbury who said that, you lie in bed, and when the voices reach a certain pitch, you get out of bed and write down what they're saying. That's how he created. So I think it's difficult to draw a kind of principled line of the kind you were requesting, and our dynamic, autonomous, generative brains are producing all kinds of odd experiences.
I think I made it difficult
many of which can be useful to us.
I think I made it difficult by answering the question while asking it as well. I mean, it is very difficult to tell when imagination ends and psychosis begins, because it is such a creative sort of experience. And a lot of times I've encountered patients, acutely psychotic, schizophrenic patients, who still don't necessarily show signs of harm to themselves, others, or in any way to their reputation. And you have to then consider, okay, is this technically an issue right now? And sometimes it's just not.
Yeah. I guess creative work, particularly creative fiction, is interesting to think about in this context, isn't it? Because novels don't survive. People don't continue to read them unless they kind of work. Readers provide quite a harsh test for the output of novelists. So the fact that people continue to read James Joyce or Virginia Woolf, I think, implies that although somebody reading for the first time might have thought this is crazy stuff, it kind of turns keys in the locks of perception successfully. So some things, of course, won't. I mean, I remember going to a poetry. I gave a talk at a poetry festival a few years back, and I listened to one particular reading late in the evening, and I thought, this is really just thought disorder. This isn't poetry, and I may have been wrong, but
and you may have been right, to be honest. But
I may have been right. I may have been right, and I think the kind of audience then, or the readership then provides the test.
Yeah. In your work, Adam, in your work with, let's say, epilepsy or memory, have you seen how imagination sort of influences one's sense of self or continuity of memory?
So, tell me if I'm answering the wrong question here, but certainly what your question initially reminds me of is the experience of people with aphantasia as opposed to hyperphantasia. So some people with aphantasia have a very, very thin autobiographical memory, verging on what's been described recently as the syndrome of severely deficient autobiographical memory, again, at the creation of Brian Levine's group. So these are people who say that when they read their own diaries, it's pretty much like reading about somebody else's life. They really can't re-enter their past experiences. They can't relive them. And that can be a bit problematic for them. It can leave you with a rather insecure sense of your own identity. And I studied a couple of American participants who were both in the situation actually with memory loss related to epilepsy rather than aphantasia straightforwardly. But they said that when they told stories about their past, they often felt rather insecure. They kind of wondered whether this was just made up because they couldn't re-inhabit these past experiences. So I think that the ability to relive experiences contributes to a sense of personal identity and continuity over time, and helps to give our memories a kind of authenticity that otherwise they can lack. I'm not sure whether that's quite what you were asking about.
No, I guess the reason why I brought that up was because when you look at disorders like epilepsy or any sort of neurological disorder, the question then arises, can imagination be trained, rehabilitated, or perhaps therapeutically employed? So what are your thoughts on this, on recovery, cognitive flexibility?
Yeah. So I think thinking specifically of people with aphantasia, it seems to be difficult to cultivate sensory imagination. So many people with aphantasia say, can I learn to visualize? Quite a lot of people with aphantasia anecdotally have told me that they've tried. They've used streaming techniques where you look at an object, try to hold it in your mind's eye, try to do this for longer periods. It does seem hard for folk with aphantasia to build a sensory imagination. So my guess is that there's some biological obstacle there. But
have you seen, Adam, have you seen cases where people have learned to change this experience? I know a lot of your data does show that genetically there is a factor, so you're more likely to have it if someone in your family does have it. But have you seen any success stories? Not terribly.
Yeah. Not that I have detailed accounts of. No, quite a lot of people have said that medication has occasionally given them access to imagery, which is really very interesting.
Was it the psychedelic type of medication? What would it be? Is it
sort of psychotropic? Sometimes psychedelic, sometimes other drugs working on the CNS. Something I hope to study further. Yeah. But I haven't seen really detailed, convincing accounts from people who've been able to train themselves
Well,
to visualize.
Adam, you're in Exeter, right? So
I'm in Edinburgh these days.
Shustas Hughes is right there. So psychedelics, Dr.
Yes.
Peters, yeah, he's right there. So
Yeah.
you can probably help study this.
Yeah. 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 But for people who have imagery, then it can be used therapeutically for sure. Imagery is, of course, used a good deal in mental practice by athletes, by musicians. It can be harnessed in forms of psychotherapy. So yeah, it has.
Did we touch on dreams and daydreams? Because I know part of your work talks about how it seems to be distinct, and I know at some point you mentioned the fact that people who dream are able to produce these mental images. Do we have a reason why neurologically? Is it just because of specific parts of the brain, or would you like to explore that a bit deeper?
Yeah, sure. So there's this very, very intriguing dissociation. It's not true for everyone, but most people who have aphantasia, most people who lack the ability to call imagery to mind deliberately, nevertheless dream visually. So they experience visual images in their dreams. And this can seem very puzzling. I think it becomes less puzzling when you know that, or when you learn that the brain's in a really very different state in wakefulness and dreaming, sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. So it's in a different state in a neurochemical sense. So when we're awake and alert, there's a whole range of neurotransmitter systems based in the brain which are working full tilt to maintain wakefulness and alertness. And in dream sleep, most of those systems are quiescent. You have a good deal of acetylcholine around, cholinergic drive, but noradrenaline, serotonin, dopamine systems are all relatively quiescent. So the brain is in a different neurochemical state in dream sleep to the state of wakefulness, and it's also in a different state of regional brain activation. So when we dream, we switch off frontoparietal regions that are involved in cognitive control, and we activate regions deeper in the brain stem and in the limbic system. So one way of caricaturing or characterizing the difference would be that wakeful imagery is top down. I ask you to imagine an apple, you make a kind of conscious decision to do so, and you then drive sensory systems from the top down, whereas dreaming is a much more spontaneous, bottom-up kind of process. So there is good evidence that when we experience visual imagery, both in wakefulness and in dreams, we activate visual cortices, but I think the way you arrive at that activation is very different in those two states.
And I think something else we should mention and perhaps touch on in more detail would be the fact that certain parts of the brain are more affected in aphantasia than others. So the typical case would be your patient MX, the one that sort of introduced you to all of this. Exactly which part of his brain had the stroke, and have you noticed since that certain other regions, perhaps not the same one, have contributed to aphantasic states?
Yeah. Okay. So MX is the patient who got me interested in this topic about 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago. So this was a patient who was referred to me by his general practitioner with a letter saying this man's lost the ability to imagine. And it turned out that specifically he'd lost the ability to visualize. He is a very articulate man who previously used to get himself to sleep by visualizing the faces of friends and family, could no longer do so. He said that when he read a novel, he would enter a visual world. Previously, this was no longer the case. His dreams actually became avisual initially, so he would have dreams, but they had a narrative content rather than a visual content. So we were very intrigued by this really compelling account he gave of a change of the experience, and in the end did a functional brain imaging study to see what the difference was when he tried to visualize from the brain activity of people with imagery. And it turned out that when he looked at famous faces, he had normal brain activation, just like the control participants he was a surveyor. Control participants were matched for occupation. But when he tried to visualize, he hypoactivated regions in the visual brain, in the occipital and temporal lobes, areas that most of us activate when we visualize, producing that faint echo of perception that we experience when we visualize. He could no longer activate those areas. So that seemed to be a nice neural correlate for the change he described in his experience. I was expecting, or I hypothesized that we might see something similar in people with lifelong aphantasia, who we then went on to study quite a while later. But it turns out that the story is probably a little bit more complicated. There is a difference between brain activity in people with lifelong aphantasia and people with imagery, but it's not quite as simple. And it looks as if there's one particular area that may well indeed play a key role. This has been christened recently the fusiform imagery node. So this is an area in the undersurface of the temporal lobe, which seems to play a particularly important role in visualization. Its activity co-varies to some extent with the vividness of our imagery experience. Its function's not yet fully understood, but it does seem that variations in the activity of this region may play a key role in lifelong aphantasia, which is much the commonest form. That accounts for the great majority of the 4% I mentioned earlier.
Adam, where would you like to see the future of aphantasia research going? What are the next steps? Are you guys working on anything specific, or do you know any labs doing something similar? Where is this headed?
Yeah, I mean, there are still a huge number of questions to answer. One question is, what are the subtypes of aphantasia? So I don't think it's a single thing. I think it's a variation in experience which can occur in a number of different contexts. So, for example, it may be that there's a subgroup of people with face recognition difficulties, prosopagnosia, or interesting that the fusiform place area is quite close to the fusiform imagery node. Subgroup of people with particularly severe memory difficulties, a subgroup with autism. So we need to try to tease out the various subtypes. Not surprising that there should be a number of different types, because if you have a complex network of the kind that's responsible for visualization, you might predict that it could be perturbed in more than one way. You mentioned genetics earlier. If you are aphantasic, there's a roughly tenfold increase in the likelihood that your first-degree relatives will be, hinting at some genes involved in the modulation of imagery vividness. Wouldn't be surprising. Genes influence all our psychological capacities, so far as I know. So that's something else we're keen to look at. More to learn about the neural basis. There's an interesting question, which is much discussed at the moment, about whether people with aphantasia have unconscious imagery in some sense. I think that has to be true in a very broad sense, because people with aphantasia are able to recognize things just fine, as a rule. So they know what things look like. They must have stored knowledge of appearances in their brains, which you would have thought is just what you need to generate imagery. But they can't take that extra step, even though they can recognize they can't use that knowledge to generate conscious images. So in a very general sense, I think there must be unconscious imagery in the brains of folk with aphantasia, but whether that's a good description at a finer grain is being debated at the moment. The nature of unisensory and multisensory aphantasia is interesting. So I've said that most people with aphantasia have diminished imagery in all sense modalities, but it's not true for all. There are some people who seem to have very focal visual or auditory aphantasia, for instance. So there's more to learn about that. More to learn about the mental health associations of aphantasia and hyperphantasia. So I mentioned that aphantasia is linked with autism. It might protect you from PTSD, for example. Hyperphantasia might perhaps predispose you to psychosis. So really quite a fair number of questions for us to keep.
It's so weird. It even makes me think about certain other neurologists and their work. If you take someone's work like Michael Gazzaniga, someone with the corpus callosectomy, all the implications of the parts of the brain that now see and speak versus the other, and how would you study those people who are phantasic? If you think of V.S. Ramachandran's phantom limbs, I mean, how are they going to experience these phenomena? It's quite an intriguing set of features, because you could study this with everything.
Yeah.
It's like the sky's the limit type of thing with aphantasia or hyperphantasic patients. Is there anything in particular you're looking forward to within this research?
So I'm really interested in all the topics I've mentioned. What I'm hoping to write another book focusing on this, because the book that we've been talking about, The Shape of Things Unseen, ranges very widely over the imagination, and I don't really feel I've done justice aphantasia and hyperphantasia yet. And what I'm particularly looking forward to is actually talking to people more, because I've so much enjoyed my conversations with people who enjoy these rather intriguing, different kinds of experience. I want to get a closer feel for the texture of their experience. So conversations are my research focus for the next year or so.
When you look at this, let's move into sort of the concluding features where it comes to philosophy, meaning future of imaginative science. If imagination constructs not just what we perceive, but what we value and mean, what do you think this tells us about the nature of existence itself?
I think it tells us that the universe is much odder than it seems. There's a huge amount of mystery, and I'm not a religious person, but I'm certainly prepared to accept that there's a huge amount we don't understand, probably never will understand. That the universe is a very fascinating, but also deeply, deeply mysterious place. I think, yes, there's an Auden poem where he somewhere says that the world is much odder than it seems, and I very much subscribe to that view. I have a recurring feeling, sort of moving from the universe to the human, that this general line of work should be helpful in improving human relations. We talked about the fact that we have a huge capacity for difference, storing difference in our brains. And I think this helps to explain the conflicting and sometimes incompatible cultural traditions which we live within. I think understanding that our brains have this huge storage space for difference, and that culture is fundamental to our lives, but that which culture we happen to operate in is very much a matter of chance, highly contingent. That kind of cluster of facts should both make us respectful of other traditions, and also, and of course, respectful of our own, but also willing to accept that no tradition is privileged, has a claim to supremacy. I think there's a kind of strong argument for tolerance from science in this line of thought, and tolerance is something we badly need, it seems to me.
No, I agree with you. I think at this time of life, it's clear that is the one thing we definitely do need. Before we close off, Adam, there's something I have to ask you. I mean, I ask everyone this question. Do you ever think about the mind-body problem? As a neurologist, someone deeply ingrained with tinkering with the human brain and mind, at what point do you see this separation? Is there a separation? Is there a mind-body problem? And do we have free will?
So it's really what drew me into neurology. So I did a philosophy and psychology degree, and it was sort of the mind-body problem that motivated my decision to become a neurologist. And I remember sitting in cafes with friends, I guess aged about 20, just unable to understand why everybody wasn't talking about the mind-body problem. I thought this was such an extraordinary problem that it should be really absolutely in the foreground. And I wrote a book about consciousness, my first book, because I was so fascinated by the topic, and I remain fascinated by it. But I guess I've come to the conclusion that as it's currently posed, the mind-brain problem is insoluble. And I suspect it's insoluble because the concepts that we are operating with aren't up to the task at the moment. I think we probably need to adjust our understanding of both mind and matter in some fairly important ways to bring them into line with one another. But I think that has to be doable in a sense, because they clearly are so deeply interconnected that there must be sense to make here. I'm just not sure that. I think the hard problem of consciousness is, as it's sort of typically stated in insoluble. So I've somewhat set it to one side. And I guess I came to the conclusion that while consciousness was absolutely fascinating, it's consciousness per se is not what distinguishes us from other creatures. And I became rather fascinated by the idea that imagination, as we've been discussing, is the capacity that draws the line.
And with these imaginative states, when it comes to certain people's work, Benjamin Libet, others, do you think that people have free will? So, because I find that when someone has a certain definition of consciousness, then they're left trying to explain free will, and whether they have one or not sometimes depends on their view of consciousness.
I think I'm a compatibilist. I think that most or all of what we want free will to do for us is compatible with what we understand about neuroscience. So yes, we have free will, but our actions are in a certain other sense determined.
Well, I think, Adam, the final question I have is, do we, in some sense, imagine the world into being?
Absolutely.
You want to just elaborate on that before we close off?
I think that our apprehension of ourselves and of the world, our mental lives, are the product of our dynamic, energy-consuming, generative, imaginative brains. Yes, we imagine ourselves and the world into being.
I think that's absolutely beautiful, Adam. If someone tuned into this episode, unfortunately, right at this moment, at the very end, what would be the one thing you'd want them to know about the human brain and mind?
Let me just read you the quotation at the very end of the book, which I came across on a wall. It was graffiti on a wall in Bloomsbury. I wish I could show you when you are lonely or in distress the shining light of your own being.